Well, since 1994, the South African government has been harping on about an inclusive approach to education. Despite record levels of investment in the education system, we still rank as one of the worst in the world. Now, in its cover story this week, Finweek asked the question whether compulsory education is actually hindering a smarter economy in South Africa. Joining us to look at this further, Jessica Hubbard, Finweek Journalist, Khume Ramulifho, the DA Gauteng Education Spokesperson, and then Mark, of course, is still with us. And Mark, you wrote the story this week.
Yeah.
So I suppose it is appropriate to kick off with you. What inspired this specific story?
Okay, so basically what happened, they actually came from I've got two kids, one's age 10, one's 16. They're both in decent government schools. But my 10-year-old is one of the ones, is a child that we adopted, and so he's come with some learning disabilities along the way, and we started working through, and he tends to go through quite a predictable pattern each year, which he starts the year off poorly and then kind of catches up with everybody else. This year he hasn't started off particularly well at all, and we started going through his workbooks, and I noticed that the one workbook the teacher hasn't looked at in a month, in a term and a half. Now this is a decent government school, and the teacher hasn't looked at this book in a term and a half. And again, I stick my hand up, parents should also have been checking it as well, but this kind of brings it to a head. And I kind of started thinking about the situation. You have a disengaged parent, which in this case is me. You have a disengaged child, because the child's not usually keen on doing the work that's in front of them, and you have a disengaged teacher. So tell me, what do you get? You get a disengaged learning environment. And I kind of started doing some reading about this whole concept of compulsory education. Should one be forced to go to school? And the Free Market Foundation's actually written some quite interesting research around the fact that if you actually stop making it compulsory for people to go to school, there's a tax reason. There's some tax reasons in terms of return on investment for your taxes, where people that don't want to be at school can walk out the door. And then there's also just a...
So you're not paying for those people who are actually hindering the system?
Correct. You're not paying, you're not trying to subsidise it. Now, I get the whole thing about education being important. I don't for a moment argue that. But, you know, I started chatting to some of the teachers around this, and they say one of their biggest issues is, and irrespective of whether it's a rural school or a decent government school, they cannot maintain any level of discipline because it's very easy. If the parents don't like your decision, so the one teacher relates to me a story about how they give the child detention on a Thursday or Friday, and the very next day a lawyer's letter arrives to say why you can't send this child to detention. So now suddenly you're fighting the system again. The rural schools don't have the resources to do it. They try, they really do try. But you ultimately have this environment where you're trying to force people into this little box, try to do as much as possible to try and get as many people through the system. And the reality is, despite all the hundreds of billions of rands that we've pumped into education since 1994, reality is that's not turning into a workforce. And to me, if you had a better engaged schooling environment, and you know, like to the teacher's point, if he doesn't like this person, tell him there's the door. And
yeah, I mean, it's also interesting, you know, Khume, Mark in the article brought up the fact that we've got the Schools Act in 1996, and it in fact makes it a criminal act to not have your kid in school. And it almost got me thinking about the labour laws in South Africa, and perhaps a liken to that it makes it difficult to fire people. For teachers, the Schools Act makes it difficult for parents to decide what they want to do with their children. Teachers, in fact, can't even kick children out that are disruptive and you know, bad influence. What are your thoughts in terms of the legislation that guides the education system right now?
I think the legislation is correct. I will support the legislation regarding making education compulsory, because there's also age band which we need to look at. So with regard to the labor one which you make reference to, again, age also plays a factor, that those are people who are independent at that stage. But then with regard to children who, some of them not necessarily through their own choice, they find themselves in a situation where they're trapped into poverty. And looking at South African society, which is characterized by inequality, I concur with the Act, or support the Act, in the sense that we need to provide them with opportunities. Where those parents can assist, they do make, they do support them, even within the schooling system. But we are saying we need to look children as, in totality, to say, let's protect them and make sure that we prepare them for the future. So that's why I'm saying the compulsory education is from the age of 7 until the age of 16. So meaning that they themselves will decide whether they want to pursue further schooling or they can drop out of the system. That, at that level, it's no longer an obligation to a state to say they must continue with compulsory education, because by that time, we believe they would probably have a good foundation for
I've
them
got
to
Mark
succeed.
who wants to jump in here very eagerly and perhaps to put a point on the table.
But do we agree that schooling doesn't prepare people for education?
Yeah, our system is not working in totality. That is where we have a problem. But
So
I can't say, all the schools. We have schools which are doing well, which are preparing kids, and they are our models. So we want to use that as a sort of a flagship to say, can we have all our schools to be like these schools? Because when kids leave those schools, they can write, they can count, and they become better people even in life after all. But then there are other schools which is just becoming, it's a normal routine. You must wake up in the morning, go to school Monday to Friday. Whether teachers are actually playing their part or not, it's something which I think that is where authorities need to make interventions. But I'm saying from the principle to say we need to make sure that we provide opportunities for those kids. And schooling system, we believe that is where it has to take place.
Okay, but of those that are going to come through, 60% are not going to find jobs.
Yes, but that is the reality currently.
Sure.
But that's why I'm saying, politically, that's why we look at it in a different way to say, those who leave the system without necessary, requisite to get into labor market, this is what we need to do. As a member of political party, we come up with the youth wage subsidy to target that category, because we believe that you need to do an overhaul change of the education system, from teaching, motivation, infrastructure. So there are a variety of things which needs to be done. At this point of time, we're still lagging behind, because you try this, before you even complete, you try something new. So that is where we are now. So that's why I can concur with the system itself is not giving us the good results. But again, it's also on the leadership side.
There's been a lot of focus on teachers. There's been a lot of focus on teachers not pitching up for school. And then on the other hand, you've got teachers who don't earn very good wages and don't have the resources. So what do you think are the biggest problems right now when it comes to the quality of the teachers that we have in the system, and how do we motivate them to be better quality on average?
Yeah. With teacher salary, one will say that from the entry side, it's not a bad salary compared to many countries. The only challenge is when you get to the top, which is very limited, because the only way to get to top is becoming an HOD, becoming the principal or subject head or specialist, or what you end up doing is absorbed by the mainstream department where you work in the head offices. But then generally, we believe that when you incentivize teachers for good performance, that is where you will be able to retain them in the system. But at this point of time, you do as, whether you do well or you don't, you are treated as same teachers. From the DA side, we said incentivize those teachers who go extra mile, who are prepared to see the result or outcome of the children which they're teaching. So we emphasize that enter into a contract with individual teacher to say, this is what we're expecting. You have a class of 40 learners or 35 learners, so at least we want 85% of your learners passing, not just passing with average marks, but at least in a competitive way. Then if you have done that, we come now and sit down with you and say, see, you have done what we wanted you to do, so we want you to do more. These are the incentives. But currently, whether you produce 100%, whether you produce 20%, you are all teachers.
You get the same
salary. That is where we come in, and that's why we said, let's try to find something which motivates other teachers. Recognize them, that good performance, excellent performance can be rewarded. And I think that is where we need to motivate those teachers. Otherwise, they end up leaving the system and they go where they will be appreciated.
But before you start introducing an incentivization scheme, don't you think that the basic salary needs to improve? You said it compares with global standards, but there was research from Graham Codrington, which you included in your article, and he broke it down and he found that students, median high school students, the average salary comes down to $4.10 per student hour, which seems shocking to me.
Yeah, obviously, when you refer to that, again, as I talk about number of problems in our schooling, the school ratio, I see that you use 1 to 32, which is not really the case in all the schools. That you probably find in private schools or the so-called former Model C schools, where parents themselves will say, we're prepared to pay more so that we can pay teachers extra. So instead of using the same number of teachers which get allocated by department which are being paid for, you end up having more. So it means that the ratio there becomes standard. But then when you go to rural areas or township schools, you find one teacher is responsible with 60 to 70 kids in one class. So that ratio will not really have an impact or a factor. But those are some of the challenges which we are facing within the system to say, when you say you have got 1 to 35 or 1 to 40 ratio, what are you referring to? Are you just saying, because what we have observed currently, the calculation which the department did use, you count how many learners you have in a school and how many teachers there, not how many how many learners are being taught by one teacher in one class at a particular time. So they generalize and say you've got 1,000 learners, so we're giving you 52 teachers, and then they divide that according to 1,000. But when you break it down, you realize that in one class you have 55 learners who are pursuing certain stream of subjects. So meaning that one teacher is teaching 35, and maybe in other stream one teacher is having 20, on the basis that classes are not the same because of the the choices of the streaming. So I think those are some of the gaps which we find in the system. But over and above that, we also look at the infrastructures to say, in our education system, you've got your science and physical science which require experimentation, but then you don't have a lab. Or where there are labs, there are white elephant. There are no facilities to use. The learners will do
and
well.
You don't have the teacher with the competencies.
Yeah, teachers
I almost
are not
feel
taught
like we're spending a lot of time talking about the problems. Let's talk about some of the solutions that you're proposing right now, because you talk about the flagship schools. Perhaps give us some detail on what these flagship schools are doing.
Yeah, it's leadership. Firstly, you've got good management and leadership from the principal downward, and teachers do take ownership of their responsibility of their work. So these are the schools when SADU as a trade union saying we are going to embark on a strike, whether legal or not, they will say, you know what, we've got responsibility. Our job is to teach and make sure that these kids have got better future.
How many schools are there like
No, there are very few. There are very
few
at this point of time in terms of the scale. Majority of our schools, if I give an example here in Gauteng, that the more than half of our schools are categorized as dysfunctional, meaning that there's no leadership, there's no proper management, and their performance is below the target which the department have set. So
50% of the children just in Gauteng are already disadvantaged because they're being forced to go to a school that is dysfunctional. And
yes, they don't have option.
The argument that Mark's putting on the table is there a better place where they could spend their time, perhaps? Is there a better way to be able to, teach children as opposed to putting them into a dysfunctional school?
Sure. I mean, so it costs the taxpayer before. I'm taking a bit of a generalised number. If there's 3.3 million taxpayers in the EU, which Solidarity came up with a report that basically calculates that 3.3 million taxpayers pay 99% of income tax in South Africa. So that's where I'm basing 3.3 million. They're going to pay 5,380 Rand of the basic income toward basic income. And so we pay, I think the budget was about 173 billion or whatever to go to basic education in South Africa. So we're chucking money into a system where we turn it around and we say 50% is dysfunctional. So why not just rather say, well, it's money being poured down a drain. Why don't we invest in specific things that cater for specific needs? We take the good kids and we put them into an environment where they can excel, instead of forcing, as it stands at the moment. If you are in let's use myself, Randburg as an example. I've got 3 schools that I can apply to. I don't have the option of any school. I've got to apply to a certain school in my feeder area, and then there's 200 kids or parents sitting at 3 o'clock in the morning hoping to get their kids onto waiting lists. It's a system where you're cramming as many people as possible, and eventually it's going to break. And if 50% of them are already dysfunctional Gauteng, the system is broken.
I think one of the interesting points that you made, which I think came out of the Free Market Foundation, was a suggestion of universal learning design, where you have a certain percentage of students in a class who cannot engage or are not designed to engage with the material that's being put forward to them. So they are perhaps more amenable to technical skills, or to becoming a mechanic, or to becoming a designer, which doesn't necessarily make them sort of engaged with maths and science teaching. So perhaps we need to structure our education where we give children the option to go a different path from earlier on, so they don't come out of schools thinking they're stupid or that learning is a waste of their time. So we actually equip them with skills that are going to be able to, they can serve a market, money. Serve a purpose.
But at what point in time is that appropriate for a child? Because there is a certain level of, numeracy and, literacy skills that you need just to kind of operate as a functioning human being?
I think, firstly, we don't prioritize our foundation phase to the level which we want to prepare these kids for future opportunities. And we try to focus much on the last leg, which is our metric results. And that is a problem in the society, that everyone, when we talk about education, it's when we look at metric results. But when we look back and say, where is the foundation phase? For example, you have our early childhood centers. They are caring centers, not learning institutions. And that is where the foundation is supposed to be. You find repetition rate very high at grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. And that would tell us a problem, to say why we've got high repetition rate from the foundation phase, where they're supposed to have a good foundation to prepare themselves for the future. But equally, again, in terms of the system itself, you were making a reference of whether we're paying them enough and the likes. Here in Gauteng, currently we have got a budget of 29 billion rand, which is education department budget. Out of that 29 billion rand, 75% of it goes to staff. So it means that it's paying for the teachers. So you have 25% to build your new schools, to renovate your schools which are deteriorating, to buy textbooks, and all the other things which you need to put in place. So I think the question is, are we getting value for the money? And again, we need to look and say, this is personnel which you have. If you are a teacher, are you giving your best? If you're not giving your best, what recourse do we have as an institute, as a government, to say, you're not giving us what we want? But how do you do that? Because you can't enforce that when you don't have an agreement with individual teacher.
So is that what needs? I mean, is that going to be implemented in South Africa, those contractual agreements, one-on-one with teachers?
The minister has agreed in principle, but the trade union is saying no. But then that is a question to say, who has got powers? We from the DA believe that the minister is the one who is responsible, not the union. Correct. So minister must step up and say, we are entering into an agreement with individual teacher, not with a group, because this is not a group orientated, because that is where our things went wrong, on the basis that it goes to even promotions, that if you belong to a certain union, you get motivation from a union to say you must be a teacher, not because you're the best. So we're saying, if you've got contract which is very clear, we'll be assessing you based on the contract which between an employee and the employer you have agreed, that is what you need to do. Then you factor in teacher development training, which is key, because we need to upskill our teacher personnel. Yep. At this point of time, most of them, you find that they got into the system long time, and now there are a lot of changes which are coming, but we don't have targeted training. What type of training or teacher development we have is general. You go for a training workshop and that's it. So the number of workshops which you have are not really teacher targeted based on the subject they teach, which that is what we believe it's supposed to be. But you only police that when you've got an agreement to say, this is what we expect you to do. How to do it, we assist when you are lagging behind and say, 1, 2, 3 must be done, but this is what we are doing to assist you to get there. Yeah. But that is not what we are doing currently.
So I just want to wrap up on this point here. There was a SACMEC report in South Africa, and they said more than half the teachers that teach in grade 6 cannot pass grade 6 English and math. And these are the kids, these are teachers, these are teaching people. And this is what I agree spot on, the situation about basic literacy in South Africa, basic literacy, basic mathematics skills. They are so critical, and we're getting it wrong, because there's this thing, they call it education inflation essentially, where you're basically ramping up what's important. So now it used to be a matric's important, then suddenly a diploma was important, now suddenly a degree is important, then it's an MBA. And it keeps, the focus keeps going to the tail end of an education setup that ultimately we forget what happens right at the beginning. If you can't do the basics right, you get the situation where half of the people are not able to teach the people that they're teaching.
Well, just before we wrap up the conversation, what about new types of education systems that are very much technology driven and not requiring perhaps a skilled teacher, perhaps someone who oversees the whole process? What about systems that are driven by and online learning?
The DA has been pushing for that, and where we're in government in the Western Cape, we're trying to put some technology to assist, especially in areas where you have unqualified teachers who are teaching kids. So we realize that the prospect of those kids to succeed are not there. We have like telematic satellites where we're trying to reach as many learners as you can, so that you use qualified teachers to reach those learners. And we have been saying the same. Gauteng, in this province, they tried the Gauteng Online, which is Gauteng Offline. So they tried to install computer labs where the idea was good, which we supported. Even today, we support the idea. But the implementation of the project has been characterized by wastage of resources. 3 billion rand can't be, you can't say what is that has been used for. And yesterday I just visited two schools in my constituency, and I found that the labs are there, but in one school it's a storeroom, in other school there's no connectivity. And the money is being wasted. So we're saying if we can make this right from the beginning, you change the method of teaching, you also provide learners with an opportunity to interact with the technological world, which is easy for learners, because they are very active. You give them cell phone, they just show you that how quick they are to use technology. So it's exposure, make facilities available.
But Sam, it's worth pointing out though, when it comes to that flipped learning model where you have e-learning combined with teachers, those teachers need extensive training as well. There are a couple of schools that are doing a good job at this. Spark is one of them, and they've trained those teachers, and it's been a long process. So if we're going that route, we still need to invest in our teachers quite extensively.